In the 3rd century BC, Rome faced its greatest enemy. One man, a Carthaginian general named Hannibal Barca, led an army into the Italian peninsula and terrorized Rome for over a decade, despite having fewer resources and fighting on Rome's home turf. He handed the Roman Republic many of its most humiliating defeats, and in the process, developed a reputation as the greatest general in the ancient world. Learn more about the Second Punic War and Hannibal's campaign against Rome on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Quince. I've been telling you about Quince for quite a while now, but perhaps it still hasn't sunk in for some of you just how affordable Quince can be. I went to their website and checked out several prices. A woman's Mongolian cashmere tee, which costs up to $175 from other retailers, is available for just $44.90 on Quince. A men's comfort stretch trench coat that goes as high as $498 on other sites costs only $99.90 on Quince. A European linen chambray fitted sheet set that will run you $270 at competitors can be purchased for only $85.90 on Quince. These are serious discounts on high-end luxury items, and they can do this by working directly with top artisans and cutting out the middlemen. Quince gives you luxury prices without the markup, passing the savings on to you. Keep it classic and cool this fall with long-lasting staples from Quince. Go to quince.com/daily for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/daily. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/daily. This episode is sponsored by Fiji Water. You've probably heard of Fiji Water and have seen it in stores. Well, Fiji Water really is from the islands of Fiji. Drop by drop, Fiji water is filtered through volcanic rock, 1,600 miles away from the nearest continent and all its pollution, protected and preserved naturally from external elements. In this process, it collects a unique profile of electrolytes and minerals, resulting in more than double the electrolytes as the other top 2 premium bottled water brands, giving Fiji water its smooth taste. Fiji water's electrolytes are 100% natural, and this water even has a perfectly balanced pH of 7.7. I've recently been trying to reduce my consumption of diet soda, and I found Fiji water to be a great alternative. Visit your local retailer to pick up some Fiji water today for your next backyard party, beach day, hike, or even your home office. Fiji water is Earth's finest water. Hannibal was born in Carthage in 247 BC during the final phase of the First Punic War. He belonged to the Barcid family, a rising political and military house led by his father, Hannibal Barca. Carthage was a trading superpower, being one of the most important trading hubs in the ancient Mediterranean. The city was colonized by the Phoenicians, but eventually grew to become an empire of its own. Carthage also happened to be one of the principal rivals of ancient Rome, with the two societies being engaged in a series of 3 wars from 264 to 146 BC. These were known as the Punic Wars. The First Punic War lasted 23 years, ending in the year 241 BC. The war was fought over Sicily, where Carthage had already established several colonies. As Rome began to expand, the two civilizations found themselves in an inevitable conflict. To grossly oversimplify the war, Rome eventually defeated Carthage after successfully upgrading their navy, causing the Carthaginian stronghold within Sicily to collapse, forcing them to surrender and end the war. Hannibal's father, Hamilcar, was one of the Carthaginian generals during the later stages of the First Punic War. He was one of the more successful Carthaginian generals. By utilizing guerrilla tactics against the Romans, he was able to keep most of his army intact. After Rome defeated Carthage, Hamilcar watched as the city he loved lost the majority of its overseas territories and was forced to pay a massive war reparation. Desperate to prevent his country from falling into obscurity, Hamilcar decided that Carthage would need to expand to a new, lucrative territory. Hamilcar decided that the Iberian Peninsula would be the best place to colonize, as its massive supply of gold and silver would be perfect for funding Carthage's war reparations. According to legend, his son Hannibal asked to accompany him on his mission, and his father agreed under one condition. The condition was that Hannibal would need to swear an oath of eternal hostility to Rome. To make this oath, a 9-year-old Hannibal would have had to have placed his hand in the blood of a sacrificed animal on an altar and sworn to the god Baal. After taking his oath, Hamilcar and Hannibal both moved to the peninsula in 237 BC. And here, Hamilcar would expand Carthage's influence. A side effect of this is that Hannibal grew up in a military camp. This gave him connections with the army and early experience in military strategy that almost no other child had. Unfortunately for Hannibal, his father would die in battle while in Iberia, leaving Hannibal's brother-in-law, Hasdrubal the Fair, not to be confused with his younger brother Hasdrubal, in charge of the Carthaginian forces. Hannibal served as one of the officers underneath him. Hasdrubal worked to continue expanding Rome's influence over the peninsula. Part of this was signing a treaty with the Romans that stated that the Carthaginians would not expand north of the Erbo River as long as Rome didn't expand southward. Hasdrubal the Fair was later assassinated 7 years after the death of Hamilcar by the slave of a Celtic king seeking revenge. The new leader of the Carthaginian forces in Iberia was the 26-year-old son of Hamilcar, Hannibal. As commander of the Carthaginian forces, Hannibal worked to consolidate power within Spain and establish a new city called Cartagena. This city became an economic powerhouse. However, watching the Carthaginians expand their influence over Iberia was threatening to many Roman senators. And this led Rome to take decisive action. The Romans made an alliance with the city of Saguntum, which was located near the modern-day city of Valencia. The Carthaginians considered this to be a violation of their earlier treaty that stated the northern Erbo River would serve as the line between Carthaginian and Roman influence. To counter the Romans, Hannibal laid siege to Saguntum and eventually captured it after 8 months. Hannibal then had the loot taken from the city and sent to Carthage. The move to send the loot to Carthage would prove to be savvy, as the Roman Senate sent a delegation to Carthage demanding that Hannibal be punished for violating the same treaty. The delegation demanded to know if Hannibal laid siege to the city under Carthage's orders. Carthaginian leaders responded, saying both nations had little proof of breaking the treaty. The leader of the Roman delegation responded to this, stating that Carthage could either turn Hannibal into them and there would be peace, or that the two nations would be at war. Carthage chose war. The Second Punic War was going to be difficult for Carthage to win. Strategically, Carthage was in a bad position. They had a weaker navy, making it nearly impossible for them to attack by sea, and the Roman legions outnumbered their armies on land. For many nations, this would result in taking a defensive position and letting the Roman army come to them. But Hannibal didn't like this option. Instead, he wanted to attack Rome on their own home ground. In late 218 BC, Hannibal took his army, consisting of 40,000 infantry, 12,000 cavalry, and 38 war elephants, and crossed the Erbo River into southern Gaul. Learning that Hannibal had made it to the Alps, Roman troops returned to Italy and readied their defenses for a campaign for the next spring, which was still months away. The Alps were notoriously dangerous, especially during the fall and winter season, so the Romans weren't concerned that anybody would attempt to cross, as that would be crazy. Unfortunately for the Romans, Hannibal was insane. Hannibal had his army abandon its siege tools and parts of its supply train and began to cross. The conditions were brutal. As they were crossing a mountain range in the winter, they faced blizzards, avalanches, and freezing temperatures. Additionally, the army would face surprise attacks from tribes that had lived in the mountains and had little food. The conditions were truly horrific, but against all odds, they crossed the Alps in just over 2 weeks. Despite making it over the Alps, the army was in poor condition and had lost most of its war elephants. To replenish their supplies and men, Hannibal made alliances with local tribes that were hostile to Roman rule. In November of 218 BC, the Roman and Carthaginian armies met at the banks of the Tichinus River. The Romans expected the Battle of Tichinus to end in victory, but they were in for a surprise as both armies planned to rely heavily on their cavalry in the battle, which would give Hannibal a distinct advantage. The Carthaginian cavalry was eventually able to overrun the Roman infantry and severely injure Scipio, who was saved by his later-to-be-famous young son. This battle marked the first of many defeats Hannibal handed to the Romans, and the next major conflict would prove to be even more disastrous. The Battle of Trebia was considered to be the first major battle of the Second Punic War. Taking place on the Trebia River, Hannibal prepared to face off against the other Roman consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus. Hannibal had spies who informed him about Sempronius's desire for glory and his rash decision-making. Hannibal knew that he could bait Sempronius into a battle that would benefit him, so he did just that. Hannibal took advantage of the Romans' tradition of alternating between consuls leading the army every other day. On a day when he knew that Sempronius would be in charge, he made his move. Hannibal strategically used war elephants along with Balearic slingers to crush the enemy. Many Romans died fleeing for their lives or drowned in the river. By the end of the battle, Hannibal's forces had roughly 5,000 casualties, but the Romans had 20 to 30,000. This victory was crucial for Hannibal as it helped him gain the support of the Celts in northern Italy. In the spring of 2017 BC, Hannibal managed once again to get one over on the Romans. The Romans were blockading most of the supply routes to the north. They believed this was an effective strategy because it would prevent Hannibal from getting closer to Rome. However, the blockade left one spot open. This was known as the Arno Valley, which was a marshland the Romans considered to be impassable. And Hannibal decided to prove that assumption wrong once again. The trip through the marsh was brutal, lasting 4 straight days and nights. His men crawled through thick mud and deep water, and many men ended up dying from illness or infection. Hannibal himself didn't come out of the marsh unscathed. While crossing the Arno Valley, he received a nasty eye infection, causing him to lose his sight in one eye. Though he faced casualties and his army was weakened, Hannibal was about to get around the Roman forces and prepare his next attack. At the end of the marsh lay the Roman army at the shores of Lake Trasimene. Hannibal successfully ambushed the Romans, killing 15,000 men and taking another 15,000 prisoners. It was the largest and most successful ambush in military history. For many nations, the amount of casualties Hannibal was inflicting would cause them to surrender, but Rome was not like other nations. Rome was absolutely unwilling to surrender and took drastic measures. The Senate made Quintus Fabius Maximus dictator. Making someone a dictator in Rome was done in times of emergency and granted who was ever chosen 6 months of absolute power, and I covered Fabius and the Fabian strategy in a previous episode. As dictator, Fabius gained the reputation of being a cunctator, or delayer. His plan was simply to avoid fighting Hannibal by any means necessary. Instead, he opted to use a policy of scorched earth. The strategy was effective, as it prevented Hannibal from gaining important resources to sustain his army. However, it was very unpopular with the Senate. The senators wanted a quick victory, and the strategy of delaying battle was frustrating, especially since Hannibal kept looting the senators' estates in southern Italy for supplies. This led to the Senate removing Fabius from the position in 2016 BC. The Republic then elected 2 new consuls, Terentius Varro and Aemilius Paulus. The 2 consuls were given command of an army of 80,000 men and were given one goal: to destroy Hannibal. Unfortunately for the Romans, Hannibal had other plans. He attacked a supply depot outside of the city of Cannae to provoke the Romans, and on August 2, 2016, the Battle of Cannae commenced. Hannibal expected the consul of the day, Varro, to place his men close together to attack the Carthaginian infantry placed in the center. Hannibal was correct in this assumption and placed his more experienced infantry at the flanks. As the Romans attacked, Hannibal had his center retreat while his flanks bent around to encircle the Romans. The Romans ended up becoming packed together so tightly they couldn't even swing a sword. Hannibal then had his cavalry charge at the Roman cavalry, completely chasing them away. When the Roman cavalry was gone, the Carthaginian cavalry took up a position in the Roman rear. The Battle of Cannae saw somewhere between 50 to 70,000 Romans die, including one of the consuls, Aemilius Paulus. It was the worst defeat in Roman history. More Roman lives were lost in a single day than American lives were lost in the entirety of the Vietnam War. After the battle, Hannibal tried to negotiate peace terms with Rome, but the stubborn Romans refused. This decision could have been disastrous to Rome. Every day, Romans would talk about Hannibal ante portas, or Hannibal is at the gate, yet Hannibal never came. Hannibal's decision to not attack the city of Rome remains one of the most significant military decisions in world history. Hannibal's troops were exhausted and needed rest. Additionally, the army didn't have proper siege equipment for Rome's defenses. And finally, Carthage was reluctant to send reinforcements. Rome eventually placed a new general in charge of the Roman armies, Publius Scipio, or as he's better known to history, Scipio Africanus. Scipio didn't attack Hannibal directly. Instead, he went to Spain and drove the Carthaginians out of the territory. Additionally, the Romans finally accepted the Fabian strategy, meaning that they just avoided attacking the enemy, favoring to contain the problem instead. The biggest problem occurred when Scipio Africanus landed in northern Africa after his campaign in Spain. This action finally brought the war to Carthage. Fearful of their survival, Hannibal was called back to defend the city. The end of the Second Punic War occurred in 202 BC with a Roman victory at the Battle of Zama outside of Carthage, a subject I covered in a previous episode. Hannibal was placed in charge of the Carthaginian army, but faced an enemy who understood his tactics now. Scipio Africanus devised a strategy to combat the war elephants by creating gaps in their ranks, allowing them to easily pass through. At Zama, Rome got the decisive victory that it was looking for. Carthage was in ruin. It needed to make war reparations, renounce all of its overseas possessions, and obtain permission from Rome to take any military action. Hannibal remained involved in Carthaginian politics for a few years until Rome threatened war against Carthage if he didn't leave the city. Gone from Carthage, Hannibal continued to take action against the Romans and their allies. He had a few victories during this time, but ultimately he was backed into a corner by the Romans. Not wanting to be captured, Hannibal committed suicide by poison at the age of 66. Carthage would only exist for another 35 years as a Punic settlement, before finally being defeated in the Third Punic War. Hannibal's legacy far outlived the man. Whenever Rome faced struggles in the future, the phrase "Hannibal is at the gates" would continue to be used. Roman military reforms after the war included greater flexibility in command and new attentiveness to cavalry and scouting, reflecting the lessons that he forced upon them. Hannibal has become one of the most respected military leaders in history. Generals from Frederick the Great to Napoleon to Schlieffen studied Cannae as a model for battlefield envelopment. In the modern imagination, Hannibal stands alongside Alexander and Caesar, among the few commanders whose name alone evokes entire campaigns. He did not destroy Rome, yet despite not doing so, he secured a place among history's greatest generals. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. Research and writing for this episode was provided by Olivia Ash. My big thanks go to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon. Your support helps make this podcast possible. And I also want to remind everyone about the community groups on Facebook and Discord. This is where everything happens that's outside of the show. As always, if you leave a review on any major podcast app or in the above community groups, you too can have it read on the show.